Welcome to Words on Words, a podcast sponsored by the University of Nevada, Reno Writing Center. Hi, and welcome to Words on Words. I'm your host, Iris. I'm a grad student in the English program here at UNR. I'm joined today by Reese and Drake. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself for our episode today.
Hi, my name's Reese. I'm a political science grad student in American electoral politics.
My name is Drake Gossi. I'm a graduate student in English with a specialization in technical communication, genre studies, and rhetoric.
So today's topic of discussion is how to read academic writing. We've all come across scholarly articles that have been difficult to read. This could be a result of a complicated subject matter or perhaps the style of writing used in the article. Being able to decipher these articles is important in a university setting because these things are essentially what you have to understand for research projects, synthesis papers, and class discussions. So we'll be talking about strategies we use when we approach an academic paper, how we handle some of the jargon we may see, and how we decide what is important information within an article, stuff like that. So let's get started with that first question. How do you approach an academic paper? Like, what do you look at first, or what are your steps you take when you first find a source that you want to read?
Well, the first things that I look at are, of course, the title. But the title is, a very undervalued element, I guess, of the article. Especially, sometimes I'll check to see if keywords are inflected both in the title and in the keyword section of the journal, just to see if it's even relevant to pursual. Because depending on the topic, if your search strategy is to find the articles first before reading them, then you're going to place a heavy emphasis on title, abstract, and keywords.
Yeah, I think a lot of the process of searching for articles to begin with is finding as much of a vertical slice of what you believe not only the theme is, but also whether you can get as much of an idea about the article without actually reading it. It seems not to labor the point, but a lot of research is either skimming over some of the more key important points of the article, or simply just saying, okay, what do the surface level details show me about what this article is about, so that I don't end up wasting my time within the research process, like reading the entire article, for instance.
So what do you look at to figure that? So we have titles, but sometimes titles can be a little misleading. So I will also look at the title, and then I will typically read or skim through the abstract, and then I might look through the article itself and see what kind of section headings there might be, what kind of, if there are visuals, what kind of graphs they're using, what those are saying. A discussion section, I might read a few sentences within there and see if it's kind of on topic with what I want to find. Do either of you, so going beyond title and potentially abstract, is there anything that you look at to decide the usefulness of an article?
So as opposed to just reading linearly the article, I will just control F and just micro focus onto particular areas in the article that are using words that I know are important. But if you're at the beginning part in your research process, you're not even going to know what those words are. So you're going to want to, or at least I will, do what you were saying a second ago, Iris, is, just read the introductions, read the topic sentences, read strategically. And then, the locations with text that are always of the highest value: introductions, conclusions, topic sentences, discussion sections, if your article has a discussion section, and depending on the discipline, the method section. But also, I feel like something that's undervalued or not discussed enough is actually the evidence that's used in these articles, because what can happen is a little known aspect of academic writing is taking the evidence from an article and then having that either lead you in new research directions or actually using that evidence as a way to find a new source and actually using that evidence in something that you write. So,
yeah. I think on that note, it's incredibly important to at least look at not only some of the footnotes of what the sort of sources that the article is using, but also look at whatever the bibliography, the reference section that the article has, to know that perhaps the author is using a lot of the same sources or has some overlap with your own research to give you an indication of, if you don't want to read the entire article, looking at those sources and saying, okay, what's the general conversation that the source is entering into? And is there some overlap with my own research that, of articles that I may be using within my broader argument? And also looking at, breaking your articles into, or broader argument into themes, right? That way, when you go into an article and you're like, I don't want to spend the, hour plus reading this article, or I can look for those keywords of topics.
Yeah, and that, I would just add on that really becomes important at, a research stage that I didn't even know really existed, which is like the last stage, which is when you're actually writing a paper and you could be coming across articles that you don't have time to read at all. And at that point, you're going to be using the Control F function a lot. And at that point, you're looking at, as Reese was saying, you're looking at the reference section. You're looking at titles of subsections. You're looking for themes.
Yeah, and I think that touches upon the whole idea of time management within the research process, because if you're at the very beginning of your research process, you have not ample amounts of time, but more time than you know what to do with, then you want to at least use that wisely in terms of absorbing as much of the valuable information that you deem as valuable as possible. And then as you get further into the research process, knowing that you're not going to really, as you get into scholarly articles that you view as either impenetrable or somehow confusing in some way or another, knowing that you're not going to, you don't have to consume every single bit of information, nor should you, because your time is limited.
How do we decide what information is important to take away from an article? Because I have worked with students here, I don't know if you guys have, where they bring an article and they're supposed to use it in a lit review or something. They don't know what is important within the article. So how do either of you decide what the important information is? Do you just Control F those keywords we were talking about and use that, or does it depend on where you are in your research process, where if you're reading to just learn what other people are doing, or if you're reading to prove a point?
This is, I don't know, I find this one of the trickier and more counterintuitive aspects of the research process, especially for those who are beginning a research project, because this gets to, it's a paradox, which is you don't know what you're missing until you know it. You can't know
the known-knowns,
you can't know until you know. And this is unavoidable. What's unavoidable at this stage is actually consuming the article, because what you need to know the way in which the scholars in the discipline you're working with are actually using terminology. And I'll give you a really good example of this, actually. So a student and I, a student wanted to, she wanted to go into nursing, and her topic was I'm really interested in how nurses deal with the fact of being in close proximity to people who are dying all the time. But so you might think, so it's let's say you're putting things into search engines like death, dying, proximity. Nurses have their own technical terms of dealing with those things that, unless you are already immersed in that field, you're not going to know. So I remember it took us, me and the student, I think almost 45 minutes of actually doing the things that Reese was actually saying. You're going through the article looking for the terms that are reflected in the references and in the footnotes, because that's usually how the researchers code their own stuff. But and we didn't know that there was a term palliative care and burnout, which, I didn't know that, and you could do an entire research project without knowing those terms and kind of have a skewed research project. But the thing is you actually have to, and that's why it's so important at the very, very beginning of the research project to locate those articles that are the more important articles and to consume them and kind of go from there, so that you actually have some kind of knowledge of this is the way that the insiders are discussing these terms. I don't know if you guys want to chime in.
Yeah, I think one of the more important things, I think that touches upon the what Drake said about the paradox of research, that you really have to like do enough of a deep dive into the field to actually understand like what you don't know. It's the old Socratic.
And what to look for.
Exactly. It's the Socratic saying of, I only know that I know nothing. But like it's the idea that, especially as you go into a well-established field where plenty of scholars have kind of made their imprint upon that field, a lot of databases will have the function of how many times has this article been cited by other authors. So that's one of the things that you can always do is look at not only the most, like, I guess in scare quotes, like popular article, but also the one that's had the most profound effect on the field, so that you know where you need to start when looking up that jargon, when looking up those kind of the terminology within the field. Because usually the people who develop the field, who are the most impactful, will have the more comprehensive kind of definition of those terms, because they're introducing it for the first time, or for some of the first times, or for some of the initial times. So
the whole idea of reading a journal article as like a self-contained unit is kind of deeply flawed. Mm-hmm. Reading a journal article goes beyond actually the linear flow of information from title to through abstract to conclusion, because you have to navigate paradoxes like we're talking about. You're forced to like almost deal with what I call like a journalistic literacy, which is just what I mean, like knowing how to work with academic journals, and that involves looking at a journal not in terms of the self-contained unit.
I don't even think that the article needs to be read in a linear way. Like, you don't have to start at the introduction and then move through the article. I will often just read the conclusion or the discussion section and see where they ended up, and then if that seems relevant to me, or if that seems interesting, or if it's relevant to what I'm looking at, then I might go back and look at their methods, or I might go back and look at the data that they looked at, depending on the kind of article. So I kind of read it in a bit of a piecemeal. Yeah. So or if like there's a chart that looks really interesting, I'll read that. But oftentimes within that time constraint, I'll just skip over the introduction, because that's usually just setting up the article in the kind of broader context of the scholarly discussion. And if I'm already aware of that, like what you're saying, Drake, about how it's kind of a broader discussion that all these journal articles are part of, and you have to understand that. If I kind of have already gotten there, so that'll be probably the later part of the research. But if I'm already there, I'm just reading conclusions, I'm reading what new information this article is actually presenting, and not really reading any introductions or maybe methods, depending on what I'm reading. So I'll skip over that and won't read it linearly at all.
I don't know, just one of the things I would recommend to someone who was just beginning to have to consume a lot of journal articles would just be to let them know that the way that journal articles are produced is in this recursive, not linear way, and then they can also be decoded in that way. Yeah, just to not let that the seeming flow of the information from up to down kind of trick you into thinking that the most important information is
up front.
Yeah.
And I think sort of going off of that point, if the journal articles themselves aren't written within a vacuum, if they contain all of this kind of the discourses of that community, and then like are responding to various other authors, there's no reason why you should have to work within a vacuum when you view that journal article, right? Viewing it as its own self-contained thing. Instead, understanding that you can scavenge for information when you need to. You can jump around, in a non-sequential way throughout the article, because you're not like there aren't any laws governing like how you should
have to read
exactly, right? It's not super like set in stone how you should look at this article and how you should deal with it. So
you both have mentioned technical terms that appear and jargon that appears in the articles that we tend to find. So how do you manage a paper full of jargon or written in a convoluted way, whether the subject matter requires a kind of dense writing or not?
Well, I think going back to, the paper itself may be full of jargon, but the author will at least, unless you're dealing with someone who's insane, it's the author will at least have the sense to hopefully introduce those terms in the kind of, if we're talking about this in a cynical way, the pre-established kind of norms of the field, right? They're going to introduce those terms in a way that will hopefully give you a holistic understanding of like what those terms actually mean, even though those terms might be spread out and there might be 50 some odd terms within the thing of like, oh my gosh, here are all these individual concepts or things that they want to introduce. I think so. There's that. There's looking for those cues within the paper itself. There's also like, don't be afraid to, if you're not necessarily understanding of those terms or don't seem to like get how the author is introducing those terms, like if you have someone in your department or in your field that you feel has a better grasp on those terms than you do,
Google stuff,
or just googling
I'll
stuff,
do that.
right?
If I don't know a word, I'll like write in the margins. I'll like word I don't know equals
other word I don't know.
Other word I don't know equals, yes, I'll include a definition that has all these phrases I don't know, and
Right.
then I'll have to like define my definition, and then it just goes in a circle.
Yeah, like when I was writing my senior thesis for history, I the reason why I had an advisor, like one of the reasons why I had an advisor was to
Is a requirement? Don't you have to have an advisor?
well, no, but that's one of the uses of that is to essentially have someone who's well versed in the discipline, to hopefully give you a better understanding of like what is this founding term that has a like 50 pages worth of history behind it by X author. Like, what does this actually mean, even though I've read this entire thing and I don't understand it, So that's one of the things, is using people from the discipline that you kind of have built rapport with. And then not being afraid to, as you said, look those terms up on Google, albeit to like better understand how the author themselves is defining it.
Yeah.
So
One of the, I guess, big things I learned was to stop looking for terms, or stop thinking of these terms in terms of their meanings or like truth. So it's like, okay, I found this term, I don't understand it. I'm gonna like closely read it until I understand it. To like kind of
Keep repeating it until it makes
yeah, I have to know what this thing means. So like I'm just gonna keep forcing it. I came to the conclusion that it's like, well, actually the meaning of the term is the way that it's used in the field, which doesn't have any really correspondence to like an ideal meaning. So, I mean, what I'll do is take either the word or the phrase in context, just in quotes, put it into Google. It'll come up into, almost guaranteed, another Google book from an academic press. And then you see, so what this is it's the phrase, but it's somebody else in the field at a different point in time using it. So then I read the context around the term. Sometimes you'll have to do that 4 or 5 times. What it gets you is it gets you 4 or 5 different ways that published authors use the phrase, rather than you by yourself as an isolated, academic just trying to like sponge out the meaning of it.
And outside of terms, what about when just the writing itself is very dense? So like, you know what these words mean, but in the order they're presented, they mean nothing to you. So there's myths about academics knowing everything and talking in the highfalutin language and kind of almost making it a door between the academics and maybe the new reader or the new student. Is there any particular method either of you use to kind of decode that language? Do you just skip over it and go to something that makes more sense? Because I know a lot of, even me with my rhetoric classes, there was this very dense material, and I knew kind of the language they were using, but the way they were using it was strange and different. Is it just exposure? Is it reading it how other people are talking about?
Yeah, that's
general things, or is it just
if there's prose that you know that you have to write on or that you have to know, find somebody else who knows it better than you do. So I learned philosophy not by sitting there in a library. Although I did do this at first, and it does work, just extremely time consuming. I remember, spending an entire summer reading Marx's Capital. I really read the book, but it took me, I could have read, 25 books in that span of time. So the thing is, like, you make use of the reader's guides, make use of all the secondhand commentary, like read that, but you read the secondary material first, and then you go to the primary source material as a kind of key to help you out with the context. Because in some cases there simply is no going to the primary source material first. It's because you will not understand it, and there's no point in reading something that you won't understand because you won't understand it. So just make use of the commentary.
That's a good point. I think perhaps Spark Notes maybe gets a bad name.
Bad rap.
Yeah, a bit of a bad rap in some circles because it's seen as maybe a shortcut or like you're cheating to get to the information without reading it. But it's a good idea to read that secondary material to even get that background information that you need to understand what you're going to read, but also, even when we were talking about important information, know what the point of that more dense material is. So if you have all these academics that are pointing out these important aspects of the Marx work, then you know what you should be focusing on within the main text.
Even if you're dealing with some sort of academic text, whether it be a book or otherwise, of like you're looking up a book review, just to understand, okay, I can't absorb, all 250 pages of this in this amount of time because of this paper is due fairly soon. Like you have to take that shortcut to understand like how this text is contextualized within the broader discussion that's going on.
On that note, we'll have to bring our episode to a close. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to Drake and Reese for joining me on this topic. And we hope you'll join us for our next episode.